Greetings, ghosts and ghouls, and welcome to another Lights Out story time with the Houston Public Library. My name is Rachel, and today I will be reading the story, The Woman in the Waves by R. Denham. Although this story is scary, it should be appropriate for children ages 10 and up. Are you ready? Not too long ago, in a town not far away, there lived a wealthy young businessman who had made his fortune on a very unlikely business deal. Rumors whispered through the town that the businessman had been seen walking the beach in the moonlight with a mysterious woman shortly before he made his money. Many said that he must have made a deal with the devil, and that was the secret to his vast wealth. When his colleagues jokingly asked if the rumors were true, the businessman just shrugged and laughed. Time passed, and the businessman and his wife were blessed with 3 children, 2 daughters, Helen and Ingrid, and a son, Henry. The 3 siblings were adored by everyone and were just a little bit spoiled by their doting mother and father. The children wanted for nothing, and their laughter often was heard ringing through the halls. The oldest sister, Helen, was determined to marry for love and spurned the attention of her father's many business contacts, who courted her hand from the time she made her debut. One day, as Helen was passing through the town in her father's new motor car, she spotted a sailor drinking in the local tavern and fell instantly in love. She ordered her driver to pull over and sent the driver into the tavern to retrieve the sailor for her. The sailor was invited to ride in the carriage back to the mansion to meet her father. Overcome by Helen's beauty, the sailor eagerly followed the driver, and the 3 made their way back to the mansion. When they arrived, Helen presented the sailor to her father as the man she wished to marry. The businessman thought it was strange to marry someone at first sight, but Helen insisted it was love, and eventually her father relented. Helen and her sailor were married the next day. The day after the wedding, the sailor returned to the ship and sailed away on a months-long voyage. He promised to send his wife a white dove each day so that she would know he was safe and thinking of her. Helen watched the sea from the rooftop balcony of the mansion every day and smiled and laughed when each day a white dove flew to the balcony. But one day, the white dove didn't arrive. Then the next day passed without a dove. As dusk fell on the second night without a bird from her love, Helen walked along the beach, the waves gently lapping over her feet. As she walked, deep in thought, her eyes fell on a small, dark shape, half buried in the wet sand. It was a dead dove. Suddenly, a haunting laughter echoed across the water. Helen screamed and ran back toward the house. Helen was inconsolable, sure that her sailor was dead. Her parents and sister tried to comfort her. Any number of things could have stopped the doves from arriving. Maybe they got lost or blown off course by a storm. But Helen wouldn't listen to her family and descended into a deep, black grief. She stopped eating and wore only black, believing she was widowed. Weeks passed and still no dove nor letter arrived from Helen's husband. She grew pale and thin and stopped eating, spending her days watching the sea from the rooftop balcony or walking the shoreline, the hem of her skirts dragging back and forth with the waves. One evening, Helen did not return to the house for dinner. Her father sent servants searching the grounds to no avail. Helen had vanished. That night, a woman's keening cries echoed through the grounds, but the servants could not find the source of the wailing. In the misty gray just before dawn, Helen's middle sister, Ingrid, walked down to the beach. She had been unable to sleep. The mysterious wailing sounded just like Helen when she was distraught, and Ingrid spent the night praying for her sister's safe return. Walking along, Ingrid noticed a sodden pile of black cloth drifting in the shallow. Water, gently pushed back and forth by the waves. She rushed to the cloth and discovered her sister dead. Ingrid's scream rang down the beach, and she was quickly joined by the rest of her family and the servants. The businessman stared at the waves, eyes welling with salty tears. Then he heard it. A watery chuckle whispering over the waves. The businessman paled and stepped back from the water's edge. "Oh, what a tragedy!" the businessman cried. "Helen must have been surprised by a wave and dragged into the water. Such a tragic accident." The servants, familiar with Helen's grief and fragile state, exchanged pointed looks, but did not gainsay their employer. The businessman and his wife quickly arranged a funeral for their daughter, squelching any whispers that Helen's drowning might not have been an accident. Ingrid and her brother were deeply saddened by their sister's death, but time passed and laughter began to fill the hallways of the mansion once more. Ingrid blossomed into a beautiful young woman and had many suitors. Her two most persistent suitors were Mr. Gallywag and Mr. Welch. Mr. Gallywag was wealthy and austere and wanted to marry Ingrid to raise his own social standing. Mr. Welch was poor but passionate and given to emphatic declarations of his undying love for Ingrid. One spring morning, Mr. Gallywag called on Ingrid and asked for her hand in marriage. Ingrid was flattered by his attention, and, being more interested in financial security than in love, readily granted her acceptance. Ingrid's mother and father were happy with her upcoming marriage and quickly organized a ball to announce the betrothal. The night of the ball arrived, and Ingrid danced and laughed and drank champagne to celebrate her upcoming nuptials. Several hours into the engagement ball, a servant approached her with a note that read, "Join me on the beach." The note was unsigned, but Ingrid was intrigued and quickly left the brightly lit ballroom, cutting through the shadowed garden to the shore. It was some time before Ingrid's parents or fiancé noticed that she was no longer dancing or chatting with friends. Discreetly, they searched the ballroom for the bride-to-be and became alarmed when they still could not find her. Thinking she might have stepped out of the warm ballroom for a breath of fresh air, her brother exited into the gardens. Ingrid was not there. The sound of the waves crashing on the beach beyond the garden called to Henry, and he made his way down to the beach. A woman's laughter rippled across the shore as he stepped onto the sand. He looked up and down the beach for Ingrid, but did not see his sister. He did see a huddled shadow a ways down the sand. A low, keening moan reached his ears, and he noticed the shadow rocked back and forth in time with the waves. As he got closer to the shadow, Henry realized it was a man rocking back and forth, moaning and clutching something to his chest. Henry was close enough now to recognize Mr. Welch, looking disheveled and with bloody scratches on his arms. "Mr. Welch," Henry inquired, "are you well? What's wrong?" Mr. Welch clutched the object in his arms closer and stared at Henry. I didn't mean to..." The scene before Henry was suddenly bathed in bright moonlight as clouds blew out to sea and the full moon shone down. Henry could see that the limp object in Mr. Welch's arms was Ingrid. Henry yelled for help and knelt down, snatching his sister from Mr. Welch's arms. Her hair was a wet, tangled mess, and her ball gown weighed down with seawater. Dark bruises marred her neck. "I didn't mean to," repeated Mr. Welch. "I just wanted to talk to her, but I was so upset, so angry." Mr. Welch remained on the ground. He stared at the sea and wiped his hands down, arms covered in bloody scratches. She just wouldn't listen." A crowd, summoned by Henry's yell, was nearing the two men on the beach, their lanterns casting bouncing shadows across the sand. Abruptly, Mr. Welch stood. He looked at Henry. Tell your parents that I never meant to hurt her." With those final words, Mr. Welch sprinted the few feet to the water and dove into the shallows. Henry yelled again and ran to the water's edge, waves flowing over his boots. He stared into the water, but there was no sign of Mr. Welch. "Henry," asked his mother, "what's happened?" Then she got a good look at the still figure on the sand and dropped to her knees, wailing her grief. "How could this happen? How could this happen? This family is cursed." For the second time, the businessman heard a watery laugh whisper across the beach. He knelt in the sand next to his wife and tried to console her. "Don't be ridiculous. We aren't cursed. Bad things sometimes happen." His wife pushed him away and smoothed her daughter's tangled hair away from her face. "This family is cursed," she repeated softly. And so the businessman lost a second child to the sea. A funeral was held, filled with whispers about curses and suppositions about the cause of the family's ill fortune. The loss of her second daughter broke the businessman's wife. She cried all the time and cursed the ocean and raged against the constant sound of the waves hitting the shore. She swore that she could hear screams for help in the night and gasps as though someone were drowning. Her grasp on reality became more and more tenuous, and she was eventually sent to a sanitarium far from the coast, where she finally found peace away from the ocean. The businessman and his son continued to live in the mansion, but there were no more parties, nor laughter, nor joy in their home. Several months passed, and the businessman and Henry became used to their new, much quieter lives. One night while eating dinner, Henry stopped eating and cocked his head. "Do you hear that?" he asked his father. The businessman likewise paused to listen for a moment, then resumed eating his soup. "I don't hear anything," he said. Henry shrugged and continued his meal. A few minutes later, he suddenly dropped his spoon and stood up. He looked out the dining room windows toward the beach. "A woman is yelling for help," he said. The businessman looked at the servants lining the walls. "I hear nothing. Do any of you hear a cry for help?" The servants all shook their heads. "There it is again," yelled Henry. "She needs help." He threw open the French doors and ran down the shallow steps into the garden, heading for the beach. "Henry, stop!" shouted his father, who ran after his son. When the businessman reached the sand, his son had already removed his shoes and jacket and was staring out into the waves. The servants had followed the businessman to the beach to provide whatever assistance they could. Henry continued staring into the waves, then pointed, "There! Do you see her? She needs help!" The businessman and the servants looked where Henry was pointing. They did not see or hear anyone. "Henry," the businessman pleaded, "there's no one there. No one needs help. Please come back inside to the house." The businessman placed a hand on Henry's shoulder, but his son shrugged it off. "How can you not see her?" Henry yelled. "I have to help her." With that exclamation, Henry rushed into the water. "Henry, no!" screamed the businessman. The servants all cried for Henry to return to the beach. Several of the better swimmers tried to follow, but they were pushed back by forceful waves. The businessman watched his son swim farther and farther out and saw his son's head sink beneath the waves. "No!" the businessman cried, sinking to his knees. The servants rushed back to the house to get help. The businessman, alone on the beach, knelt on the wet sand just beyond the reach of the waves, weeping. The waves slowed and the sea became like glass. The businessman could see his son's body floating in the distance, but he still would not touch the water. Slowly, a form rose from the still water. It was a woman with dark, sunken eyes and long hair matted with kelp and other sea plants. She smiled at the businessman, baring sharp, pointed teeth. "Hello, Gerald." Her voice was crushed shells tumbling against each other. "Did you think I'd forgotten about you?" The businessman shuddered and bowed his head. "You didn't hold up your end of the bargain," the woman said. "I made you rich, gave you standing in society, gave you beautiful children. You were supposed to come into my waves years ago." The businessman wept softly. "You took my children." "Yes," she said. "And now I'm taking you." With those words, the woman grabbed the businessman and, laughing, dragged him into the waves, never to be seen again. It is said that if you are on that stretch of beach near the abandoned mansion when the moon is high, you can still hear his cries between the crashes of the waves. Thank you for tuning in to another Lights Out story time with the Houston Public Library. Follow us on social media to hear more spooky stories brought straight from our library to your home. Until next time, bye.